Hi folks, Dr. Andrew Chappell here from Andrew Chappell Natural Bodybuilding. Today I'm going to talk about the fat-free mass index and estimating genetic potential of natural bodybuilders. Can we actually use this as a method to sort of say what the upper limits are of natural muscle accretion? So what I'm going to talk about is the fat-free mass index, how you would potentially calculate your fat-free mass index, what the fat-free mass index might potentially mean for natural bodybuilding. There's this idea about 25 kilograms per meter squared being an upper limit for genetic muscle mass accretion. I'm going to talk about, can we actually use this as that upper limit? I mean, is it any good or not? And then I've got some summary slides where I'm going to go over everything that I talked about in this video. So first and foremost, what is the fat-free mass index? Well, the fat-free mass index is a score that you get which is indicative of a person's muscle mass relative to their size. Okay, so it's calculated in a very similar way to body mass index. And how it works is, you take your 75 kilogram bodybuilder, and he might be 174 centimeters tall, and he would have a BMI of 24.77 kilogram per meter squared. So that's his BMI, and we could use this BMI to sort of work out risk factors, if you like, or as a clinical indicator for this person's risk of relative disease. We can also use it crudely to sort of get an idea about a person's distribution of body fat on their body. So the correlation with body fat and BMI is roughly about, say, 60%. So you can't explain body fat percentage fully based on BMI, but you can get a kind of rough idea. But this isn't about BMI, we're going to talk about fat-free mass index. So, fat-free mass index is based on a person's fat-free mass relative to their height squared. So it's exactly the same, more or less, as calculating body mass index, but you use your total fat-free mass to calculate it rather than your total mass. So if we take the same example that we had before, we work out what that person's fat-free mass is, so we need a little bit more information to work that out. We work out that that bodybuilder had, say, 12% fat mass, or 12% body fat, if you like. Do some calculations, then we can say, okay, well, that bodybuilder roughly has around about 9 kilograms of fat mass, 66 kilograms of fat-free mass, and then from there we can do the sums in the same way that you would do the sums for BMI, and we can work out that this bodybuilder has a fat-free mass indicator of 21.79 kilograms per meter squared. Now, when I was making this video, I sort of considered, is this the best way to express this data? Should it be as fat-free mass per kilogram meter squared? But when I looked in the literature of how other people report this, I see they report it in a similar sort of way for BMI. Now, that would be that person's fat-free mass index score, as I said before, and you can see it's an indicator of that person's muscle mass relative to their sort of size. So you can compare individuals with different fat-free mass indexes, and obviously the higher the fat-free mass index, the higher the amount of muscle mass any said individual is likely to have. You can see there's a slight correction factor as well included here, so if a person is taller than 180 centimeters, then we can use this fat-free mass index conversion factor. And if you do it on this example that I've done here, then it works out exactly the same because the person is less, you can see, than 174 centimeters. And notice this is a typo I've made here. Oh no, sorry, it's not. My mistake. Okay, so that's the fat-free mass index. So, initially, it was invented by, well, I'm sure the concept's probably been around for longer than this, but initially, we find publications sort of surfacing around about the early 90s related to this group here from New York, who are trying to sort of use the fat-free mass index as an almost indicator of protein, energy, malnutrition. So there is some sort of clinical application of this as well. Laterally, there's also publications by this group here, you can see, over in Geneva, whereby they've tried to use the fat-free mass index and also the fat mass index, calculated in a similar way to the fat-free mass index, as an additional indicator of what a person's metabolic health might be, because we also all know the limitations of BMI. So this group had suggested that perhaps we could use something like the fat-free mass index to get a better indicator of how people might respond to, say, disease states at different BMIs or different fat-free mass indexes. However, the fat-free mass index has obviously not gone unnoticed to the fitness population. So if you do a quick search for fat-free mass index, which you can see I've done here, and type in fat-free mass index natural, you'll get 131,000 results. So you'll see a whole load of these sort of things here. Fat-free mass index calculators, you'll get steroid users versus non-steroid users, you'll get fat-free mass index for natural bodybuilders, and then you'll get these different articles as well. So people will sort of say things like fat-free mass index of 25 is pretty much your upper limit for people who don't use steroids. So people have sort of said, well, okay, you can't have a fat-free mass index greater than 25, and if you do, you're probably taking anabolic steroids. And there's tons of articles on this sort of stuff if you go out there and look for them. There's also a whole ton of stuff as well if you look on YouTube. So you can see loads of folk have made videos on this sort of stuff, so it's not just me, and you can see they're making videos about potentially fake natty. So they're saying, well, if you've got a fat-free mass index over 25, then you are a fake natty. So I thought I would probably add to this sort of confusion and see if I could maybe clarify things a little bit for a few people, maybe clear things up a little bit. As I've said, people using this index to sort of work out who are fake natties or not. Now, the original data that this idea is based on comes from a study that was carried out in around 1995. So as this article that I've had on the previous slide sort of states, this was done in a study of elite athletes. Some steroid users, some not, and it's also based on Mr America contest winners from the 1930s through to the late 1950s. So this is a study here from this group here. So released in 1995, and it looks at the fat-free mass index in anabolic steroid users and non-anabolic steroid users. And what they found was that steroid users had fat-free mass indexes exceeding 25. The non-steroid users had fat-free mass indexes of less than 25. And then if you look at the Mr America winners, this is the elite population they sort of look at here, between 1939 to 1959, and they call this the pre-steroid era. We find that they had a mean fat-free mass index of around about 25.4. So they're sort of saying from this, well, if the most muscular men in history during the pre-steroid era never had a fat-free mass index of greater than 25.4, and our non-steroid users that they looked at never had a fat-free mass index of greater than 25, then this potentially is a upper limit for natural muscle mass without the use of obviously steroids. You're not going to have a fat-free mass index of greater than this. So that's the idea, and this is where it sort of comes from. So to really sort of critique the fat-free mass index, you really have to sort of delve into this study here and sort of say, well, what did they actually do, and is it valid, more or less? So we have a look at this sort of study. We find, well, first and foremost, they recruited 156 participants from gymnasiums in Boston and Los Angeles. Okay, so this is our population here. And what they did obviously was they weighed their participants, they took their height, and then they measured body fat percentage based on skin folds. So they managed to get skin folds from a total of 134 participants. 74 of these participants were non-steroid users, so they'd never used steroids in their life, according to the reports. And it seems like they'd probably have no reason to lie to this as well, because they could easily enter the steroid arm, if they like, of the trial. We had 83 steroid users included, and then we also had 23 subjects who were using testosterone off the back of a placebo-controlled trial as well. So they were added to the mix of known steroid users as well. Now, if we look at the methods section, we can see we get this paragraph taken here, and it says that the non-users included many dedicated bodybuilders. Several had competed successfully in natural bodybuilding contests, 2 held world records in strength events, and many others were recognised by their associates as highly successful weightlifters. Thus, the non-user group probably included individuals who closely approached the maximum limits of muscularity that could be obtained without drugs. Now, I'll leave that for you to decide if you think that that reflects an elite population like was described in the previous slide for that article. Myself, I sort of remain largely skeptic. What's clear is that this population included people that obviously went to the gym, they worked out regularly, but it's not necessarily what you would describe as an elite population. Although it may have included some bodybuilders, there's no reference here to any bodybuilders that have competed in international competitions or anyone that have competed in national bodybuilding competitions. It just sort of says that, well, they've competed in natural bodybuilding contests and they did alright. You've also got some strength trainers here, obviously. And obviously, bodybuilders have got a different type of structure, they've got different types of muscle mass than people who are potentially strongmen or powerlifters. They just have different frames a lot of the time. So these people are not necessarily likely to be as muscular as bodybuilding populations. However, they are likely to be extremely muscular as well. So again, it's maybe not necessarily reflective of an elite population. However, it is reflective probably of a general sort of gym population. If we look at the Mr. America winners now. So estimates of the fat-free mass index for Mr. America winners from 1939 to 1959 are based on the heights and weights and age at the time of competition. So what they did was they got detailed information about the heights and weights of these competitors from this book here called The Super Athletes, and they were able to sort of estimate what the competitors' BMIs were from that. Following that, what they did was, and this was the second author here, I should actually go back to him, Harris Pope. He then proceeded to estimate the body fat percentages of the competitors taking part in these competitions between that time based on photographs in magazines of that era, not necessarily from competitions. Now, they did blind the competitors, so their faces were obscured, so that the Pope Harris would have no problem at all trying to identify, he wouldn't be biased in identifying the competitors, so he didn't know who they were. However, it's not necessarily the most accurate way you would like to obviously estimate the body fat percentages of your competitors. I should mention actually, you should go online after you've watched this one and have a look at some of Dr. Pope's other videos on psychiatry and bodybuilding. Some really interesting stuff he's done on that. I'm sure some of you would find really useful, really interesting. Okay, so those were the methods. That's what they did. They measured some skin folds and a whole bunch of gym goers, compared it to people that took steroids, and then he got some Mr. America winners where they find out the heights and weights, and then they estimate their body fats, and that's the study. Okay, so here's some results. So these white triangles, these reflect the non-users. These black triangles, these reflect the users of anabolic steroids. We've got height along the bottom here, and then we've got the fat-free mass index up on the axis on the left-hand side here. Okay, and then we've got this line here, and this line they use to adjust for height once they had collected all the results. So you can see you've got a scattering of competitors, and on the whole you can see that the black triangles have got higher fat-free mass index than the white triangles, ergo higher fat-free mass index in steroid users compared to non-users. What's interesting about this is that you can see that there's many non-users have got higher fat-free mass index than many of the users as well. So you can see that just because you take anabolic steroids doesn't mean you've necessarily got a higher fat-free mass index, even relative to your height. So you can see right here we've got several individuals are higher than some of these points on the scale here. So the drugs aren't the thing that are largely contributing to the fat-free mass index, it seems in all the circumstances. We've got some mean results, so these have now been adjusted based on that adjustment factor I talked about earlier on. And you can see we've got the steroid users fat-free mass index here of 24.8. The mean result here is 21.8, and the non-users over here. So this is just our mean overall. You see lower body weight compared to the steroid users here as well. So the mean is lower, and we'd expect that if we look at the other graph. These are the individual plots. So we've got all your fat-free mass index ranges along here, normalized, steroid users, and then we've got non-steroid users here. And you can see the trend is generally for the fat-free mass index to be higher in our steroid users than in our non-users here, you can see. Obviously, now there is considerable overlap, just like there was in our previous slide. So there's some overlap here, and there is some overlap here. So previously I said, well, this doesn't necessarily reflect an elite population. And I think this sort of graph really sort of testifies to what sort of population that we're dealing with here. Many of these competitors, or sorry, rather gymnasium users, you can see are not necessarily that much muscular at all. In fact, compared to a general population, some of these people might be relatively under-muscled. However, we look at the top end, so these probably reflect those successful natural bodybuilders and strength trainers. You can see that right up at the limit, they will overtake many of our steroid users, but none of them actually necessarily exceed this 25 cut-off on the list here. Again, the steroid users much higher. Okay, so here are now some results from the estimates of the fat-free mass indexes within those Mr America winners. So you've got 1939 up here, you can see on the left-hand side, all the way through to 1959 down here. We've got the mean, so that's the average. And then we've got the standard deviation, which tells us about the distribution around the mean. And if you have a look at this closely, you can see that several of the competitors, so we've got Grimmick here, famous bodybuilder, Stanko, Ross, who else have we got? Dellinger, 28, again, have got fat-free mass index estimates at well over that 25. So actually, if you go through these and count them up, 13 of the competitors have actually got a fat-free mass index over 25. So if we considered that that previous population we had was not necessarily elite, although there were some probably fairly decent competitors in terms of bodybuilders, strength athletes within there with fairly high muscle mass, we can consider that this maybe reflects a more elite population, despite the fact that our competitors perhaps never had quite the same level of conditioning, and the method used to sort of estimate the fat-free mass index was questionable. But we can see that even if it is questionable, there are several competitors here that have a fat-free mass index of over 25. Now, for comparison, what they also did in this fat-free mass index study was they compared classic bodybuilders to modern bodybuilders. And you can see right away that you have an outlier way up here. So this is 1994 compared to down here. We've got our highest reaching Mr. America winner. You can see there's more than, or almost a 10 fat-free mass index points difference between the two. Now, they looked at bodybuilding magazines again from the modern era for these ones. So you've got Mr. Olympia winners, etc. up here. So this is perhaps, I don't know, someone like Paul Dillette or Dorian Yates, if you like. But obviously, a significant difference between the steroid users and the supposed non-steroid users from the Mr. America pre-1959 era. So here are some photographs of those natural bodybuilders or Mr. America competitors from that era. So you can see we go from 1948, and I've just selected these at random more or less, but we've got 1950, 51, 53, Bill Pearl, obviously a very famous bodybuilder. Steve Reeves down here, down at 1947 is the oldest on the list. And I got all these photographs from a website called Muscle Memory. So really nice website if you're interested in looking at old photographs of bodybuilders from back in the day. So looking at these photographs, you can see that some of these competitors have got obviously a decent amount of muscle on their frame. So this guy here is particularly well muscled. No one would dispute that Bill Pearl is lacking muscle mass. But if we look at some of the other competitors, we can perhaps say that, well, not necessarily as muscular as some of our modern day sprinting athletes or Olympians, or certainly as modern day natural bodybuilders when we look at someone like John Farabotnick. Now, that's not to pick on John Farabotnick, there's probably good reasons for this. We look at the fat-free mass index for our current Mr. Olympias. So we can see we've got Dorian Yates in 1993, Ronnie Coleman in 2003, and then we go 10 years again, we've got Phil Heath in 2013. Now, if we be quite conservative of these and say they all had 5% body fat, and it is obviously disputable what the body fat percentages were of these competitors. We have the heights of these competitors, but where we really struggle is in actually trying to determine what weight these competitors were at the time. So I went looking for the weights of these competitors at various points during their careers, and these were sort of best that I could come up with. So it's very challenging if you go have a look to try and find the actual weights of bodybuilders, modern ones, and there's certainly a lot of cloak and dagger skullduggery stuff going on where bodybuilders will lie about their weight. They'll exaggerate what weights they are to make themselves look more impressive or sound more impressive. So I'll be surprised at the weights of these contest bodybuilders that were used to estimate the fat-free mass index and the body fat percentages, looking at these bodybuilders, are actually an accurate reflection of what those competitors weighed at the time of competition. So we've got our fat-free mass indexes. So just for comparison, we've got Dorian Yates 34.21, Ronnie Coleman almost 36 with his fat-free mass index, and then Phil Heath 34.54. Now, obviously, as I said before, the true interpretation of what these people are actually weighing on stage obviously is going to influence this number here. So I'm not convinced these numbers are entirely accurate, because I'm not convinced these numbers are accurate. And then this 5% fat mass on their frame again is just an arbitrary number really I use to sort of calculate this fat-free mass index. So likely higher or lower when it comes to actual stage weights. So, but maybe we can say that for someone around about this height, this weight and that fat mass, that this is probably what we're going to be looking at in terms of fat-free mass indexes. What you can perhaps take from this, well, perhaps we could say that Mr. Olympia's fat-free mass index, if you wanted to be him, then you need to have a fat-free mass index of perhaps at least 34.21 based on the previous Mr. Olympias. So I've alluded to this really already when I've talked about this, when I've said, okay, well, are these really elite populations when we sort of go back and we look at these this study that investigated the steroid users versus non-steroid users. And the conclusion that we can really come to is that, well, they had a mean fat-free mass of around about 21.8. Many of them were actually lower than this, so this means being pulled up by many people on this side of the fat-free mass index. So I don't think we can say that this is really an elite population, or it's a fair representative of what you get when you look at elite groups of gymnasium users really either. So not necessarily a great sort of basis for saying this is the best sort of or most muscular you can potentially be if we look at a cohort of modern gymnasium users. If you compare those numbers to the general population, and this is the Schultz et al. Study I had earlier on, where they did the largest sort of estimate of the fat-free mass index. You can see here they've got thousands of people within their estimate. So 2,986 males all in, 2,649 females all in. And you can see we've got their mean heights here. These are all the confidence intervals, and then we've got all these standard deviations here. And then they've split them into subcategories. So we've got 18 to 34-year-olds, all the way up to 75 to 98-year-olds. I should mention these are healthy Caucasian adults. So this is a European population, largely. We've then got down here the fat-free mass index estimates, and we've also got the fat mass index estimates as well, split into percentiles. So if you imagine if you take people in the bottom 5%, this is the bottom 10%, all the way up to the top 5% of the population. And you can see that male bodybuilders, or sorry, these are not bodybuilders, I should stress, these are just normal everyday people. Obviously, being the top 25 percentile, they're more muscular than the rest of the population, but there's nothing special about this population otherwise than they were recruited for the sake of being healthy. They didn't seek to recruit bodybuilders, for example. And we can see, we'll look at age brackets, 18 to 34, 35 to 54. If we look around here, we can see that in general, the population has probably got a fat-free mass index at the high end of around about 22.1. So in this study of non-gymnasium users, or rather just general population, we actually find a higher fat-free mass index than the Kouri et al. Paper that looked at non-users and the supposed elite athletes, where we had several distinguished bodybuilders. So this really sort of hits home of how elite this population really is, and sort of makes you think, well, perhaps we need to look at some better populations to get a better indicator of what the true fat-free mass indexes really are for elite natural bodybuilders, or what the true genetic potential is. Interestingly, we've also got data for females. Now, I've never seen data for females before, or people talking about females in the world of fitness in terms of what their fat-free mass index could conceivably be for an upper limit. But you can see here that some people in this general population have got fat-free mass indexes of around about, say, 19. So perhaps if we were to use maybe an arbitrary number, we could just say, well, maybe 20, 21 might be a speculative upper limit for female natural bodybuilders, potentially, based on these results anyway, and some other stuff I'm going to talk about later. Okay, so our Kouri population, it's not elite. In fact, if you look at the recruitment of this population, you have to go to another paper, and you find that actually the recruitment criteria is basically this. Male participants, 16 years or older, people who had lifted weights for at least 2 years. They were recruited from gyms with known steroid users as well, I should say. So they were training pretty hard in these gyms, I'm sure. And these are probably hardcore gyms, but it's not an elite population. So the population had some pedigree, but don't consider this as an indicator of what you can really achieve in terms of having a great natural physique. If we look at our fat-free mass indexes of our Mr. America winners, so I've said already, well, we've got a range from 22.6 all the way up to 28. So 13 of the athletes had a fat-free mass of over 25, and 3 of the athletes had a fat-free mass of over 27. Now, if you read this paper where this data comes from, you'll see that they make this statement. It says, because anabolic steroids were not available in gymnasiums during this era, these athletes likely represented the maximum fat-free mass attained without drugs. And the evidence they got for that is a personal communication from Todd T. So that's just a case of the authors of this paper have received an email or a letter of sorts, and they've said, well, drugs were not available to these populations, so this is probably a natural population, you can probably study it. So no other evidence is really provided for that. And we've now got into a situation whereby this is sort of permeated throughout the fitness world, where anyone from the pre-1959 era probably didn't use anabolic steroids. Now, a few interesting points here. Dianabol was famously invented in 1958. However, synthetic testosterone had been around since at least the 1930s when it was invented, and was certainly being used in the post-war Olympics, hence the invention of Dianabol. However, the likelihood of some of that stuff making its way into the gyms over in the States, I mean, you could say it was probably fairly small. I mean, remember, this is the time when we've got the Iron Curtain and the Cold War going on between America and the US. So maybe some of these drugs never found their way over to the States, but certainly we don't have strong evidence to suggest that people were maybe definitely not using these, but we don't necessarily have evidence to say that they certainly were using them either. So it's maybe a fair assumption. Okay, now with more than half the fat-free mass indexes of our Mr. America winners exceeding 25, we also have to consider the limitations. So we're estimating body fat percentage. It's guesswork at best. Okay, the true details of the heights and weights of these bodybuilders is really difficult to attain. Go online and try and find the details for the top 10 at this year's Mr. Olympia, and you'll find it challenging. So I'm not convinced entirely that they were able to obtain fully accurate information on this year. So I'm not 100% convinced that the fat-free mass indexes that you're getting of these Mr. America winners to reflect what a natural physique could attain are indeed accurate. But that's just my opinion on that. Also, the other thing we have to consider about the Mr. America contest 1939 to 1959 is that this was taking place, this contest, right in the middle of the civil rights movement. So the first black Mr. America winner was actually not crowned until 1970. So if you go back through all those pictures that I showed earlier on, you'll find that all the guys that won the contest were actually white. Now, Leroy Colbert is famous for having the first set of 20-inch arms, but also featuring as the first black man on the front cover of a muscle mag. Now, with 13 Mr. Olympia winners currently, 6 of which are African American or Afro-Caribbean, if you consider Sergio Oliva, it's quite difficult to believe that in a 20-year period that there was not some sort of discrimination going on against black bodybuilders. I mean, certainly we've got some fantastic bodybuilders here with George Payne, for example. So I find it hard to believe that these competitors were not discriminated against, and thus probably didn't make it onto that list of Mr. America winners to sort of give a more fairer reflection on what a natural physique would be. You'll notice that these champions have all got the most muscular winning award multiple times at Mr. America competitions. However, were never awarded the actual full title. Now, this idea of discrimination against black bodybuilders is not a new one. In fact, you've got Peter McGuff reported on it. It's famously was reported in Muscle Wars, and in fact, in Dmitry Lolikov's new book, he sort of talks about this discrimination against bodybuilders during that period as well. So it's generally well accepted that there was probably something like that going on at the time, and not the best waddies were necessarily winning these competitions. Also, the competition during that time wasn't like a modern day bodybuilding competition. So here's a quote from Iron Man magazine. It says, "A Mr. America who will be an ideal American in every way." So at the time, some of the criteria for winning the Mr. America competition were you had the muscularity class, of which you could win the most muscular award. And several of those black bodybuilders won that most muscular award, but didn't win the competition. You also have the symmetry and posing round, but also you're getting judged on things like general appearance back then. So if you read the rule books from back then, they talk about things like having no buck teeth, for example, and having good posture and things like this. There was also often some sort of physical or athletic test. So this idea of aesthetics winning the contest didn't always necessarily mean, or wasn't always necessarily the main criteria for winning the contest. And also there was an interview process too, almost like a modern day Miss America beauty pageant, if you like, where the prowess and the ambition of the man who would be Mr. America was obtained through this process. So you're not always seeing the best bodies winning these Mr. America competitions, which is likely to have influenced our fat-free mass indexes, our mean result that we get down here, and our results we get over here about the number of athletes that might be over or under the 25 threshold. So I think that's a really interesting point and a really important point that we have to make about these contests back then. So that's the Mr. America contest, and that's the aforementioned study. So what about modern natural bodybuilding? Well, can we say anything about that in terms of the fat-free mass index that might help us to say, well, what are the current thresholds for the upper limits? Well, it's very difficult, but this is the British Natural Bodybuilding Federation. Other natural bodybuilding federations are available. But if you're curious to know if you're a person that you're watching on YouTube or that you follow Instagram or whatever is a natural bodybuilder, then a good sort of way to sort of look at this is, well, natural bodybuilders often and very always compete exclusively in natural bodybuilding federations. So if your person's not competing in a natural bodybuilding federation, then sometimes you've got to ask yourself the question of, well, why? I suppose it comes down to what your interpretation of natural might be as well. So this federation is aligned with the Drug Free Athletes Coalition in the States, where they have their world finals. They also have the WADA Labs, and they don't suffer from the issue of the 6-to-1 testosterone ratio, hence leading to the testosterone loophole. So it's actually 4-to-1 ratio which they run at all these competitions. All the competitors are polygraphed at British finals and at world finals as well. There's also out of season and targeted testing. So this is about as comprehensive as it gets at the moment in the world of bodybuilding for determining are these competitors actually natural or not. However, we have an advantage in the world of bodybuilding in that if you want to take anabolic steroids, then there's no discrimination, there's no problem at all with people going over to compete in federations whereby they would use anabolic steroids. So that's not an issue, because we've always got this door open whereby people can compete if they're natural. So this is why I say, well, if you're natural, people that are natural tend to compete with natural bodybuilding federations. If they're not natural, they don't tend to compete with natural bodybuilding federations because it's dishonest. However, I would add, people do get caught within these federations. So there are people who are still trying to bend the rules. Now, recently I conducted a study of natural bodybuilders competing at the British Natural Bodybuilding Federation's final. So if you go on Sigma Nutrition Podcast, you can listen to some of the results from this. I presented this paper at the Nutrition Society Spring Conference, so it should appear soon in the proceedings of the Nutrition Society, and then when I eventually write it up, it will appear in there. So what I did at that competition was I recruited some bodybuilders. So I've got 50 bodybuilders all in. I got completed data sets for 29 men and 16 women. We estimated the body fat percentage of 12 competitors, so the competitors told us what their body fat percentage was, and we got numbers of around between 5 and 10% for men, which seems fairly normal if you were to look at a bodybuilding population. We then managed to work out the fat-free mass indexes of our competitors based on weighing them on the day and what they reported their height was to us. And what we found was that we have, I should mention, we split our competitors into successful men, so if you finished in the top 5 you got a trophy, and then the unsuccessful men, if you finished out top 5 you didn't get a trophy. And what we found was, well, if you were successful you had a higher fat-free mass index, so you can see here we've got 23.2. And then in our males, if you were less successful, we've got a fat-free mass of 22.7. So more muscle on our successful males. We also found, however, which is quite interesting, that 2 of our male competitors had fat-free mass indexes of over 25. So 25.73 and 25.15. So again, exceeding the sort of natural supposed threshold. So, and I have no reason to believe that these competitors were unnatural, I should add, as well. Our mean in the female competitors, I should mention, was 18.1. Okay, so there we go. Now, let's talk about my fat-free mass index just for a second here. So, here's me. I've been competing now for, I don't know, maybe 2006 was my first show, so over 10 years. So, this is me at the DFAC Worlds in 2014, I think. This is me 2014 at the British Natural Bodybuilding Federation Finals. This is 2013, and this is 2013 as well, and these are 2014, I believe. So I've got a fairly decent amount of muscle you can see on my frame, and I'm fairly lean as well, you can see on here too. So this is a particularly sick picture you can see here as well. Lots of vascularity going on. So I was in some really good shape for those competitions, I should add. Now, I'm a pro natural bodybuilder. Been competing for a long time. I also compete in other strength sports, so I do strongman. My lifts are alright in that. And powerlifting as well. I compete on stage at 80 kilograms and I'm 174 centimeters tall. Now, if we estimate fat mass on me and I say that I'm maybe 5 to 7%, then we can do some sums here based on this. So, if I'm fat mass of 5%, then I'm this weight in terms of fat-free mass, which gives me a 25.10 kilograms per meter squared fat-free mass index, and then so on down to 7% here. Now I know, because I got my body fat percentage measured at the time of these competitions, that in 2014, which is this competition here and this competition here, that I had a body fat percentage measured by skin folds, bioelectrical impedance, and I also used something called a bod pod, which is air displacement of around about, say, 5 to 6%. So we can say that I had a fat-free mass index of probably around about here. So it's not inconceivable that those other bodybuilders that I talked about when they were competing at the British finals as well, because these folks here are at the British finals as an amateur, could have fat-free mass indexes of greater than 25. I mean, it's fairly conceivable. Now, you can also see how small discrepancies in fat mass estimation, so between 5 and 7%, can lead to drastic differences in your fat-free mass index points. So you can see there's a 0.5 difference between these two results almost here. So if someone's 5% or 7%, and the conversation about how useful body fat percentage estimates actually are, or how accurate they actually are, is one for another day. But needless to say, there's a lot of dispute about how good some of these estimates can actually be, and therefore it kind of makes your fat-free mass index look a little bit shaky sometimes when you start talking about what your body fat percentage actually is. I should mention that I am a drug tester for the BNBF, so British Natural Bodybuilding Federation, and the Drug Free Athletes Coalition. So I'm no reason to lie about taking drugs or not taking drugs, and it would obviously be completely immoral and unethical if I was taking drugs and competing with these people and also being a drug tester. So you can believe me when I say that these are what my sort of numbers are, and that's what I look like without taking drugs. Okay, now there are many bodybuilders who far exceeds what I've managed to produce in my time within bodybuilding. So these are all natural bodybuilders from the United Kingdom, apart from Will Usher here, I should say. So this is David Kay. We've got Mark Claxton. We've got Nathan Williams. We've also got Shane Raymond. And then we've got Robert Waterhouse here. So all these competitors competed in the British Natural Bodybuilding Federation. They came through the ranks, winning their qualifiers, winning the British finals, and then winning their pro cards this way before competing. So you can see a great variety of different physiques, extremely muscular, extremely low body fat percentages, much more so than me. And I would say that I have no reason to believe that these people are taking drugs in any way whatsoever, and they've been all drug tested. And these are just sort of great examples of what can be achieved naturally. I would also say that these people probably have fat-free mass indexes all in excess of that 25 number as well. So again, we can probably say that the upper limit of 25 is not necessarily entirely accurate. So just to summarize, people have said that 25 is the potential upper limit for bodybuilders. This is based on work by a study that was performed by Kouri et al. However, this was a non-elite group of gymnasium winners. This was a non-elite group of gymnasium users and estimates of Mr America winners. More than half those Mr America winners, we should add, had a fat-free mass of greater than 25. However, those Mr America winners weren't always the most muscular men of their day. We also have to consider that this was over 50 years ago, and that the science of resistance training and nutrition has moved on significantly. So it's possible they could be even more muscular now in this modern era. What we really need is comprehensive drug tested natural bodybuilding federations to do studies on, so that we can get indications of what the real upper limits of fat-free mass actually are. However, the fractured nature of bodybuilding, particularly in the United States, makes it very difficult to determine who the best competitors actually are. So studying it becomes a challenge. However, limited investigations, and I should stress limited investigations, have found that these populations probably have higher fat-free mass indexes than that Kouri et al. Paper. Also, it's probably worth pointing out that even though they have higher fat-free mass indexes of 25, it's probably only the most dedicated and elite natural bodybuilders that are ever going to have fat-free mass indexes that exceed 25. In females, it seems that 20 might be a sort of appropriate starting point to sort of say speculatively this might be an upper limit, but this is purely speculation, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was higher than that. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. If you like this video, then be sure to check out Andrew Chappell Natural Bodybuilding on Facebook. Also check out my sponsors Extreme Nutrition and the British Natural Bodybuilding Federation if you are so inspired by natural bodybuilding and you want to see what can really be achieved by working out naturally and having a good diet. Thank you very much.